Today we're going to focus on the marketing phase of selling a business. You see, I'm here today with my fellow Edison business advisors, Michael Pfeffer and Steve Niehaus. I'm Eric Gall. That information, the contact information, will be available on the last slide. So at the end of the session, you will be able to write that down and copy it. So let me do a little bit of recap. We had a previous webinar a couple weeks back on the planning phase of our 9-step process. Today we're going to focus in on the marketing phase of the 9-step process. And then in the near future, we'll do another webinar, and that'll be on the closing phase of our 9-step process. So let me do a little quick recap. A couple weeks back, we did a webinar on the planning phase of our business. And that webinar was based on the business review, basically what documents that we gather up front from a seller to prepare the business for sale. We also talked about financial recasting. That's really taking the net income of a seller's financial statements, which are prepared for tax purposes primarily, and then recasting those to come up with what the seller's actually putting in their pocket on an annual basis, which we call seller's discretionary earnings, or EBITDA. And the real focal point of that session was really to get down to valuation and pricing. We talked about the methods and tools that we use to produce the valuation of the business, and then how we go about setting a price to go to market. Today's webinar is really focused on the marketing stage. We're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the listing agreement. We're going to talk about the types of listing agreements and the key elements of those listing agreements. We're going to talk about the documentation that we use, specifically the types of documents we use to market the business, and the purpose and use of each document. And we put it out there into the public domain and the private domain as well. We're going to talk about marketing and advertising, and this is really where do we advertise your business and how we advertise your business. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike Pfeffer, and he's going to talk about listing agreements.
Great, thanks, Eric. Yeah, we use primarily 3 different listing agreements, but really number 1, the standard, if there is such a thing, listing agreement, we use probably 99.9% of the time. We may see the use of the distressed sale agreement a little bit more in light of the pandemic. We do have a lot of people calling right now that have found themselves in kind of a precarious situation, and they may or may not survive, but they want to know what their options are with regard to marketing their business or the assets of that business. We also have an open listing agreement, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so the standard listing agreement, it can be modified because, as we know, every single transaction is unique, and it has certain things that may or may not need to be modified in the agreement. The agreement really lays out the terms of the deal between the seller and Edison, or the business brokers. It governs the sale of the business assets and not the stock. This agreement was put together over many years between the Business Brokers of Florida and the Florida Real Estate Commission. It's been modified a few times, but there again, it can be modified even more with addendums to fit the requirements of each specific transactions. So nearly every small business or closely held business is for the sale of assets and not the stock. Technically, a stock sale is governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but they tend to overlook small stock transactions performed by intermediaries like us. And there's actually currently legislation to exempt stock sales under 250 million in sales or 25 million in earnings. And it looks like that's probably going to go through. So there are certain instances where we would want to see a stock sale. And typically that's going to be a company that has perhaps a lot of rolling stock, like a trucking company or a taxi company, or maybe a leasing company or a fleet truck company, something like that. Or some other business that may have a lot of contracts that may not be assignable, or it might be cost prohibitive to have those contracts transferred over. Our agreement is similar to agreements all across the country, and they really cover the terms of the deal between the seller and the broker. Okay. So what are the key elements of the listing agreement? general information about the seller. And typically the seller is not the individual. It's actually the entity, the LLC or the partnership or the corporation, and the controlling members of that organization are allowing the corporation to sell the assets or permitting the assets to be sold. So we want to have a comprehensive list of those assets and their valuations. It also outlines the terms and the conditions, the length of the engagement. Typically, it's going to be about a year. It takes on average 9 months to sell a business in this environment, and maybe a little longer. It depends on, a lot of times, on SBA financing and things like that. It lays out the commissions. They tend to be fairly standard, but typically they can be modified as well for each individual case. It may or may not include real estate or a lease. In most cases, it does not include real estate. In Florida, to sell a business, we are required to have a real estate license. It's just in case there is real estate involved as well. It also outlines the results of a breach in the agreement and what the damages may be, that sort of thing. It specifies that the seller needs to cooperate with the broker so that we can provide accurate information in a timely fashion and get the business to the market the way it should be. How long the seller will help the new owner in the transition process, and whether or not they'll be compensated for their time. And this can go anywhere from a week or two up to several years, depending upon the business. It also outlines the terms of a non-compete agreement so that the seller will not compete with the new owner, and determines the length of time for that as well. Co-broke authorization. As members of the Business Brokers of Florida, and many people don't know that we actually have an MLS system for businesses in Florida, and most states do not. But as a member of the BBF, we are required to co-broke. So what does that mean, co-broke? That means that if I have a listing, I'm going to share my commission with whoever brings a buyer. If I don't co-broke, then it limits the buyer pool to the people that I know, which is not fair to the to the business that's for sale. We have a transaction broker relationship, which means we do not act as an agent for the seller. We are an intermediary, or you might think of it as a facilitator. We're there to get a deal done, and we help the buyer and the seller come to terms. There are other considerations that may come into play. And again, we have addendums that we can add to that as well. It must be signed, and it must be actually guaranteed by the signer as well. Just to backstep for a second, I want to talk a second about the different kinds of assets that we have listed. There's tangible assets, and these include the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, inventory, leasehold improvements, which is the build out of the building. And it may or may not include working capital, which is cash that's in the business that's required to run the business. But there are also many intangible assets that often get overlooked, and they're very difficult to value in some cases. So what do those include? Intangible assets may include your trade name, your customer list, your phone numbers, your logo or trademark. They could be engineering drawings, it could be computer code or programs, processes, formulas, procedures, and your workforce in place, or it might just be technical expertise. So these are those things that don't really show up on your balance sheet, but they create what's called goodwill, which is the likelihood that clients will come back and see you again. So it's the value of your business that's over and above the value of those tangible assets. Now, because of the COVID and pandemic, we may start to see more distressed sale agreements. And this is where we have a business that's a going concern. They haven't closed their doors yet, but they may be operating either at break even or at a negative cash flow, which means they're temporary. You can only lose $1 for so long. You can only make $1 for as long as you want, but you can only lose $1 for so long. In this case, it may represent an opportunity to the competition to pick up a lot of those intangible assets, for instance, a workforce in place, and you may be able to pick it up at a bargain. So we may see more of these in the near future, based on what the S&P did yesterday. I guess hopefully this is all going to be short-lived. We've already picked up our losses for 2020. So, okay. What are the key elements? The distress sale may necessitate a different marketing strategy and likely require seller financing. And now, none of the sellers ever want to finance the business. And it's understandable why that would be. In this environment, if you're going to get an SBA loan, the SBA is probably, or the bank is probably going to require the seller to hold some paper so that they have some skin in the game. They can only work typically for the new owner for up to a year, but they're probably going to have to hold some paper. In the case of a distress sale, it's unlikely that the buyer will be able to obtain a loan at all because they're operating in a negative, and the bank wants to know that they're going to get paid back. And if there's negative cash flow, that's not going to happen. So in this case, the seller is likely to have to finance the entire deal. There may be some commission adjustments which require an upfront fee to the brokers, which may or may not be returned at the closing. The asking price is likely to diminish over time to find the appropriate selling price that the market will accept. The open listing agreement, this is probably the least used. And this says that although I'm going to list your business, you can also list it with anybody else you'd like to as well. Because of that, you're probably going to get the level of commitment by the broker that's appropriate for the listing agreement, which means not much. So we'll put it out there, and if we get some action, great. Probably not going to spend a lot of time and effort on it unless there's a certain circumstance which may be a unique business. But in this case, it demonstrates to us that the business or the owner are not prepared to sell, and they may just be testing the waters, throwing a line out to see if anything bites. So once in a while we'll see this, but not very often. If you think you have a unique situation where this may apply, then be sure and let us know. So because we have an MLS system, we prepare what's called a business listing information, which is basically a teaser. So we put on this document, which goes out onto the MLS system, and it has, just like a real estate MLS system, there are two sides to it. There's a site that the public can see, and then there's also a back end that only the brokers can see. And even then, we still have the opportunity to maintain complete confidentiality by not letting the other brokers know what's in there as well. But it contains just enough information to whet the appetite and encourage a potential buyer to make an inquiry. Then what we do is qualify that business, and I think Steve's going to talk a little bit more about that. But once qualified, the potential buyer will receive what's called a CBR, or a confidential business review, sometimes referred to as a confidential business memorandum, and there's some other names as well. It contains a bit more information, but there again, we're not trying to give away everything at this point. We want to see if it's going to be a good fit for the buyer. It will typically contain a history of the business, their current situation, a financial history, and might even include projections going forward in a pro forma. We want to know about the current operations, staffing in particular. Maybe there's some unique vendor or customer relationships that you might want to mention, or geographical area that you might want to mention, the competition that's in the area, and then we highlight what are considered to be opportunity areas. So that might be an opportunity for marketing or something like that. So this will be typically the first thing that the buyers will see, and it's to judge whether or not it's a good fit for, or potential fit for the buyer, at which point we take it to the next step and learn more about the buyer.
So as Michael mentioned, the CBR, confidential business review, you also hear terms as far as CIM, confidential information memorandum. This is the package that we put together, which could be quite lengthy. This is after we have the ads and the blind listing agreement and some of the teasers, and if there is an interest, and we have a non-disclosure agreement signed, etc., we will, I don't want to use the word trickle out, but we'll feed information out to a prospective buyer. This is the package that they'll see that'll answer hopefully as many questions as possible to really see if it's a good match for the prospective buyer and the buyer's background and their financial capability. So the package includes quite a bit of information. As Michael mentioned, we get into quite a bit of detail here. An executive summary, which gives the background of the business, ownership history, etc., the customers, and important part of customers is the customer concentration, geographic locations, etc. We explain which part of the listing agreement also gets to this, but we explain what's going to be the assistance to the buyer when it transitions. We get into the employees' information. If an employee's been there a long time, we want to highlight that and some of their key people that are going to stay with the business, because that's a key value that's being transferred with the business. Some additional information is the facilities. Again, if they own the facility or if they lease it, and what's the lease terms, and there's a renewable lease, etc. We talk about the industry, changes to the industry, any special licensing require, or if there's a way to continue to qualify the business with the current owner for a period of time. A lot of the things, again, from our listing agreement get transferred as far as the restrictive covenant and non-compete. You could get into basically what we want to do is highlight the business, again, answering and anticipating the questions that may come from a prospective buyer, so we can minimize all the back and forth questions for a seller, because the seller needs to focus on still running the business. So our goal is to play an effective and efficient role of answering those questions up front and being the intermediary that we are to address those questions. A big thing we like to emphasize in the CBR is here's the current business, but what is in it for the buyer? So we talk about opportunities. What would you change? What are some other niches or other marketing approaches or other customer bases that are untapped? What are other products you can offer? And then obviously we get into the financial detail and making sure that the business is producing the required income or seller's discretionary earnings that the prospective buyer is looking for. So we have our confidential business review, we have our listing, and then we need to go out and find buyers. And sometimes we do have a list of buyers and people who are interested. So we obviously communicate with them, but then we reach out through advertising. And when we look at most of the businesses we're dealing with are Main Street and lower middle market businesses. So those businesses that, owner operator type businesses. So we do advertising, and then we do proactive marketing, and I'll get into that: social media, email, targeting campaigns to try to find prospective buyers for these businesses. As far as advertising, we have a couple approaches. If you think about lower middle market, we're really looking at the ones that are below the private equity and hedge fund targets. These are 5 million and up. 5 million in $5 to $50 million type of businesses. There's a number of tools and service providers out there that we subscribe to. Axial, Dealgate, you see the list of folks there. These are ones that play a role as far as connecting prospective buyers and sellers. So we go in there and do a search for those people who put themselves forward to say they're interested in this type of business, this type of industry. So we use those for some of our matchmaking. And then as far as advertising for the Main Street businesses, there's a plethora of service providers. Again, we subscribe to quite a few of those. And BizBuySell, BizQuest, these are sites where we post the businesses, again, confidentially. We don't put the business name out there. We just put the type of industry and provide some basic financials, etc. The Business Brokers of Florida, the MLS Michael mentioned, this is really key. And it's probably understated, but Florida, the co-broking is really a critical and viable resource for us, because we automatically reach out to, I think it's about 1,200 BBF members, 1,100, 1,200 BBF members across the state of Florida and outside of Florida who are registered as Business Brokers of Florida. So we have an instant network of folks who have their own set of buyers, so hopefully we can make a match through that. And then you can see the number of different sites, and then there's specific industry sites that we would subscribe to depending on the business we're marketing. As far as marketing goes, we have our own personal LinkedIn sites, and we share and push out information across all the social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, etc. Again, constantly trying to maximize our reach as far as finding prospective buyers. We do weekly email blasts to buyers who have previously registered with us. We do targeted marketing campaigns and subscribe to certain resources to reach out to specific industries when we know that we have a buyer or prospective business that looking to sell. We reach out across those with targeted marketing campaigns as well. And then we prospect too and call businesses on behalf of prospective buyers. So we talked about the planning that Eric mentioned. We did that in our last webinar. Today we covered the market, the listing agreement, and documenting that process and how we advertise it, etc. Our next webinar, we're going to talk about once we have a prospective buyer, how do we handle those inquiries? How do we screen the buyers? Managing through the offer process, the due diligence process, and then getting to closing. Once you get an offer, there's still a ton of work left to get to the closing table and secure the deal and make it a win-win for both the buyer and seller. So this is our series of the 9 steps. We will have future webinars, and if you are so inclined and you have a specific topic you would like us to deep dive into, by all means, please contact us, shoot us an email or go to our website and contact us. We'd love to hear from you and any ideas that you'd like for us to cover in future webinars. That would be great. So in closing, we know obviously COVID has thrown everything kind of upside down, but the one thing is still happening is that there is still viable businesses out there. There's still people looking to retire. There's still people looking to change careers and buy a business. So we still have plenty of activity happening, albeit it's a little more challenging with some of the current dynamics in certain industries. But there is a lot of businesses still changing hand. And again, if you have any questions or would like for us to address them, please let us know.
Steve, it looks like we have a couple of questions here.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Number one is, what is customer concentration?
Well, customer concentration is when you think about a business who is relying on one customer to provide 60% of the revenue, that is a high risk. So a business, a buyer coming in and says, okay, for example, Mike Pfeffer has this plumbing company and he's doing commercial work for one key customer. What's the risk of losing that? So customer concentration is a risk factor that we do in what we value the business. We want to see a healthy spread as far as customer concentration goes. So customer concentration is really just the limited number of customers you rely on for your revenue.
Here's another one. What do you mean by qualify the business?
So Eric, or you guys want to go ahead?
I think you mean qualify the buyer.
No, in this case, I think Steve was talking about there may be a case where the seller has to qualify the business or somebody else has to qualify the business.
Yeah, well, that's so. For example, when I was getting into licensing, I'm sorry. Yeah, good question. When you're licensed, when you have a like an air conditioning company or plumbing or electrical, those require special licensing to operate in the state. So if I'm coming in as a new owner and I don't have that license yet, I may need the prior owner to carry the license or continue to qualify the business for me until I earn my license. Yeah. Good question.
Yeah, I see a few other questions on here. Like, what websites do you get the most leads from? And I'll take that one. I mean, and you guys can chime in if you'd like, but in this industry, the 800-pound gorillas are BizBuySell and BizQuest. I would say probably outside of BBF brokers and the BBF MLS system, I would say probably about 80 to 85% of our leads will come from BizBuySell and BizQuest, with the other smaller sites, picking up the slack. And I would say that's more on the Main Street side. When you get into those lower middle market businesses, however, the tools that we showed like Axial and DealStream, where there's subscription services, where the more sophisticated buyers, pay to play and pay to get those premium listings, those are really the places that we would expect to find our buyers from. So, it really depends on the size of the company. But there's no shortage of inquiries on a good, solid business with good income these days. Even in the COVID pandemic, the buyer activity has still been fairly strong. and we expect it to remain so for quite a while.
Yeah, I just saw an email this morning, as a matter of fact. The first quarter on the middle market actually was the largest ever volume. I mean, the dollar wise, there were actually fewer sales, but there was more money was spent on buying businesses. There's a lot of money on the sidelines right now, looking for businesses to buy. So anybody that has a positive cash flow, particularly anything over $1 million, the family offices are just dying to get their hands on those businesses.
Yeah. Hey, Michael, the question here about confidentiality, how, when you get into the listing agreement and we talk about confidentiality, how do you maintain the confidentiality? And as a business owner, I'm concerned about engaging a business broker, because how do I make sure that my people don't know my business is for sale? How do you maintain that confidentiality?
Well, we give the seller the option to keep the name of the business private, even from the other brokers on the backside of the MLS system. All of our initial documentation does keep everything confidential. And before we release anything, we qualify the buyer. So the first thing we do is, when we get an inquiry, is we send out a non-disclosure agreement. When we get that back, then we may have a phone call, but we also want to have a financial statement as well. So we don't have a lot of tire kickers. We want to make sure that if they inquire and they're serious about it, that they can actually write the check. So once we have a conversation, we've qualified the buyer, then we can release the information to that buyer, potential buyer, with the seller's approval. And there again, then we start to dig a little bit deeper, and again, make sure that that buyer is qualified. And at that point, we may even have a conversation between the buyer and the seller, or maybe even a site visit or something like that. And the idea is, we just want to make sure it's a match. It's only a win if everybody wins, and that includes after the transaction. We want to make sure that the buyers are going to be successful and they have the skill set in order to do so. So it's not just a financial qualification, but it's a skill set qualification as well. And the more information we can gather, the better it is typically for everybody.
Good.
Hey, Steve, I see a question here on how much detail is necessary in a CBR.
Oh boy, I think the simple answer is whatever's necessary, whatever we can get the buyer comfortable with to make an offer for the business. So it's a kind of a balancing act, because there's a fine line between giving all the information, because if you give all the information, the buyer may make a decision based on that information without having an opportunity to see the business, talk to the owner, get a little more detail. So we like to get everything from the owner up front to provide as much business or much information as possible. But I think that one's kind of a tricky one, is that we want to give as much information as possible, but we don't want to steer the buyer into a decision without having the context of understanding the history, to get the owner and see if there's a good match between the buyer and seller. But you guys have the same, what's your take on it, Michael or Eric?
Yeah, I think, in a CBR, I like to provide as much information as, reasonably possible. My philosophy is that, you want the buyer to make a decision on whether or not the business is a fit to their criteria, for sure.
Yeah.
Before they request a meeting, because there's no sense in having a meeting if it doesn't fit all their criteria.
Right.
So, and then once you get past, if you give them enough answers to their basic questions, when you get into a buyer seller meeting and you get to that step, you're not wasting a lot of the seller's time on questions that the CBR didn't answer. You're really focused in on, the more detailed operational questions, more on developing a relationship between the buyer and seller, because there's probably nothing more important in a deal than trust being developed between buyer and seller. If they, genuinely like one another, feel they can work together, a deal can get done at that stage. But if you're spending all your time in that meeting just trying to answer basic questions about the business, you never get to that trust development level of conversation in that meeting. So, that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, no, yep. Makes sense. Good.
Here's one last question, I think. Can you sell real estate with the business?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're all licensed real estate agents in the state of Florida. So yeah, we can definitely include real estate in any sale.
I think that's an
Excellent.
interesting one that people don't understand. We are quote called business brokers. We are regulated by the Real Estate Commission in Florida. There's I believe it's 17 states that have a requirement of having a real estate license to conduct the business transactions as we do. So yes, we're licensed real estate agents, even though we focus on the business side primarily.
And I do see one final question, and that was, how do I get on your guys' email list? Well, all you
Ah,
do is email us and ask. So that's an easy one.
You can go to the website too, I
EdisonVA.com.
believe.
Yeah, Steve, scroll to the next slide so they can.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
There you go. You can email any one of us, call any one of us, and ask to be put on that list, and we'll get you a list of what we hope are exceptional businesses for sale in Southwest Florida, or anywhere in the state of Florida, through our BBF MLS system. And outside of that, if you're looking outside of the state of Florida, we do paid searches for buyers as well. Any following thoughts, guys, on today's
Great. I don't see any more questions.
Nope,
Good.
I don't either.
All right, we'd like to thank everyone for participating, and if you do think of a question afterward, feel free to contact any one of us, and we'll be glad to answer it.